This is an honor and a pleasure that I've never had before. To introduce my son on a platform. I can tell you, of course, a great deal about him. I used to spank him with the ruler. He just keeps at a job and wants to finish it and wants to do it well. And I think that's what we need here in New York, somebody that works persistently and perseveringly and believes in these things. And so it gives me great pleasure to introduce my seventh child, Robert Francis Kennedy.
I want to thank my mother for the kind introduction. That's what we've gotten down to this campaign. After some of these polls came out that we were not doing too well, we took Mother.
I had a lot of experience since I did it 72 years ago.
Yeah, I know. I'm going to tell them you did. Well, why don't you give your own speech? Well, see, that's it. We don't have... My brother and I never... The reason she's never introduced any of us before is because we never go on the same platform with her. I mean, we couldn't possibly compete with that. The major struggle between my younger brother and me during this campaign was where she was going to spend her time. Whether she's going to be here or in that other state to the north. Which I haven't dared say for 8 weeks.
Secretary of State, Ambassador Alphonse, Ambassador Gavin, Ambassador Bonet, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I do not think it altogether inappropriate to introduce myself to this audience. I am the man who accompanied Jacqueline Kennedy to Paris, and I've enjoyed it. I spoke a year ago today to take the inaugural, and I'd like to paraphrase a couple of statements I made that day by saying that we observe tonight not a celebration of freedom, but a victory of party. For we are sworn to pay off the same party debt our forebears ran up nearly a year and 3 months ago. Our deficit will not be paid off in the next 100 days, nor will it be paid off in the first 1,000 days, nor in the life of this administration, nor perhaps even in our lifetime on this planet, but let us begin. Remembering that generosity is not a sign of weakness, and that ambassadors are always subject to Senate confirmation. For if the Democratic Party cannot be helped by the many who are poor, it cannot be saved by the few who are rich. So let us begin. It must be said now that I have the best of both worlds, a Harvard education and a Yale degree. In 1952, when I was thinking about running for the United States Senate, I went to the then Senator Smathers and said, "George, what do you think?" He said, "Don't do it. Can't win. It's a bad year." In 1956, I was at the Democratic Convention, and I said I didn't know whether I'd run for vice president or not. So I said, "George, what do you think? This is it. They need a young man. It's your chance." So I ran and lost. And in 1960, I was wondering whether I ought to run in the West Virginia primary. Don't do it. That state you can't possibly carry. And actually, the only time I really got nervous about the whole matter at Los Angeles was just before the balloting. George came up and said, "I think it looks pretty good for you."
President, it's been a long time since a president and his family have been subjected to such a heavy barrage of teasing and fun-poking and satire. I mean, there have been books on backstairs at the White House, and cartoon books with clever sayings, and photo albums with balloons and the rest, and now a smash hit record. Can you tell us whether you read and listen to these things and whether they produce annoyment or enjoyment?
Annoyment. No, they produce. Yes, I have read them and listened to them. Actually, I listened to Mr. Meader's record, but I thought it sounded more like Teddy than it did me. But so he's annoyed.
Excuse me, Miss Montgomery.
Mr. President, your brother Ted recently on television said that after seeing the cares of office on you, that he wasn't sure he'd ever be interested in being the president. I wonder if you could tell us whether, if you had it to do over again, you would work for the presidency, and whether you can recommend the job to others.
Well, the answer is, the first is yes, and the second is no. I don't recommend it to others. At least for a while.
Mr. President, yes, Mr. President.
Mr. President, the Democratic platform in which you ran for election promises to work for equal rights for women, including equal pay, to wipe out job opportunity discriminations. Now, you have made efforts on behalf of others. What have you done for the women according to the promises of the platform?
Well, I'm sure we haven't done enough, and I must say I am a strong believer in equal pay for equal work, and I think that we ought to do better than we're doing, and I'm glad that you reminded me of it, Mr. President.
Mr. President, in the 1960 campaign, you used to say that it was time for America to get moving again. Do you think it is moving? And if so, how and where? The reason I ask you the question, Mr. President, is that the Republican National Committee recently adopted a resolution saying you were pretty much of a failure.
Well, I'm sure it was passed unanimously. I think that...
In any case, we're delighted to be here. Coming in, I met four rather angry Fitzgeralds. And they said they're tired of hearing about the Kennedys and New Ross, and what about the Fitzgeralds? And I said that was because my grandfather who was mayor of Boston, John F. Fitzgerald, used to tell everybody he was from Limerick and Donegal and Galway or wherever it might have helped. I want to have
There is an impression in Washington that there are no Kennedys left in Ireland, that they're all in Washington. And so I wonder if there are any Kennedys in this audience. Could you hold up your hand so I can see? Well, I'm glad to see a few cousins who didn't catch the boat. We're glad to...
I'm glad to be here. It took 115 years to make this trip. And 6,000 miles. And 3 generations. But I'm proud to be here, and I appreciate the warm welcome you've given to all of us. When my great-grandfather left here to become a cooper in East Boston, he carried nothing with him except 2 things: a strong religious faith and a strong desire for liberty. And I'm glad to say that all of his great-grandchildren have valued that inheritance. If he hadn't left, I'd be working over at the Albatross Company. Or perhaps for John D. Kelly. In any case, we're happy to be back here. About 50 years ago, an Irishman from New Ross traveled down to Washington with his family, and in order to tell his neighbors how well he was doing, he had his picture taken in front of the White House and said, "This is our summer home. Come and see us." Well, it's our home also in the winter, and I hope you will come and see us. Thank you.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Forum of the Institute of Politics. I'm Charles Royer, Director of the Institute of Politics, and I think we're going to have some fun this afternoon on this birthday celebration of President John F. Kennedy. We do this every year. We figure out every year some new way or some different way to recognize the contribution of President Kennedy to our country and our politics. And we're going to recognize this year his contribution to our collective wit and humor. And I think you're going to enjoy very much the people we've assembled to help us do that. We're going to start with a few introductory comments from a member of the Senior Advisory Committee of the Institute of Politics, who is also the senior senator from the state of Massachusetts, the Honorable Edward M. Kennedy.
Thank you very much, Charlie. This is really a very special day. May 29th, usually Memorial Day, was a time when all the members of the family were together. It was a special holiday, the birthday of President Kennedy, and really an important day for all the members of his family. And so today has been very meaningful to all of us, to my sisters Eunice and Pat, to Jackie and to Caroline and Ed and John, the other members of our family, because they gave the Profiles in Courage Award to a very distinguished Justice of the Georgia Supreme Court, Charlie Weltner, who is on the panel today. Charlie Weltner only had 2 terms in the Congress of the United States, but he achieved more in that brief time than many who have served a good deal longer. He was, of all 60 members of Congress from what they call the Old South states, 60 members of Congress, there was only 1 who voted for the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And then after taking the pledge, which was a tradition in southern states to pledge that you would support the ticket, and to the surprise of many in Georgia, Lester Maddox was successful in achieving the Democratic nomination in court between the oath that he had taken and his own conscience felt that it was impossible for him to support Lester Maddox, and therefore resigned his seat. When he was in the Congress and the 2 terms he was there, he wanted to be on the House Un-American Activities Committee. Senator Culver, now Congressman Culver, was on that committee as well as one of the 1 or 2 voices to try and bring some sanity to that committee that had really run wild. And what a surprise Charlie Weltner was for those members who were interested in sort of furthering the tradition of Joe McCarthy when he asked that the committee investigate the Ku Klux Klan. He was the first Southern leader that spoke out at the time of the bombing in the Birmingham church when 4 young black girls were killed. And with that statement, he became the voice of the New South. Defeated for Congress, he now continues a second period of public service as a member of the Supreme Court of Georgia, appointed and then re-elected. So I'd like all of you, if you would join me in giving a very warm round of applause to a real profile in courage, Justice Charlie Weltner of Georgia. I'll just be very brief, as I think all of us really know, certainly in the family, that President Kennedy used humor really to self-deprecating humor, often on himself, often to puncture the arrogancy of political rhetoric, and often to disarm political opponents. That wasn't always true, but once in a while he did use humor in my direction. I remember when I was first running for the Senate of the United States, And there were those that thought that I was running as someone just on the basis of a famous family name, and I was trying to distinguish myself from that tradition. And we had this magnificent dinner. We had every person in Massachusetts at a wonderful dinner at the Armory just before the election, and he said, I know my brother is running for the Senate of Massachusetts. He told me he wanted to be judged on his own, and therefore he is thinking of changing his name from Ted Kennedy to Teddy Roosevelt. So that was really very helpful to me at that particular time. The one time that I used often in the campaign, which is a true story, but it shows really the quickness of mind of President Kennedy, and he was in naval intelligence before he went out to the Pacific in the PT boats, and he went to a crowd in South Carolina, and he was talking to them about the dangers of espionage and sabotage, the dangers of fire in a factory, and he was explaining to them that the workers ought to determine the origin of the fire in the back of the factory in order to determine how to extinguish it. Fire was made from wood, put water on it. Oil and gas, CO2 on it. Electricity, foam on it, but never put water on an oil and gas fire or water on electric fire because it could spread and have disastrous results. He asked any questions. Hand went up in the back of the room and said, now, Ensign Kennedy, how are we going to know just by looking at that fire whether that fire is made from wood, oil and gas, or electricity? So we'll know exactly what to put on it and what not to put on it so that it would spread. And he thought about that for a little while and said, you know something, that's a very good question, and there'll be someone here next week who'll talk on that very subject. And that's happened to many of us. A nice warm welcome to the JFK Corps. A lot of young people that are making a difference in their community, and they're our guests here today. Finally, there's a quote on a mug out at the Kennedy Library for Dave Powers, where President Kennedy wrote these words, there are three things in life that are true, God, human folly, and laughter. The first two are beyond our control, so we must do what we can with the third. It's in that spirit. We all hope you'll enjoy the program. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Kennedy, very much. I've never heard you do that voice. I thought that was... It's difficult to recognize anybody in a Harvard audience because you leave out lots, but I did want to recognize former Governor Blanchard, who is here with us today. Governor, it's nice to see you. And the former senator from Iowa, John Culver, who is, was mentioned by Senator Kennedy, but is also a member of our Senior Advisory Committee at the Institute. Now, somebody who's really working hard these days as Assistant District Attorney for the County of New York, who will introduce for you a rough-cut videotape, courtesy of the library, that will demonstrate some bits and pieces of the wit and humor of President Kennedy. Please welcome John Kennedy.
Thank you, Charlie. Thank you all for coming today. If our respective remarks were limited to our personal recollections of my father's humor, my words would be very brief indeed. And I was thinking about how I might comment on a subject which is both very personal and yet still somewhat abstract. And I thought to myself that really the only sure thing is the somewhat wry amusement that my father would certainly regard me with, that as I sat gravely at my desk trying to chisel out some heavy words trying to describe his humor. So I'm not going to do that. But I think the choice of the topic is an appropriate one for today, his birthday, and I think that it is certainly no less appropriate that this forum take place here at Harvard, where his wit was honed and his perspective and opinions were perhaps first formed. I've always contended that my father's humor was really gotten from Teddy, but really my sense is that it was a means as much for his own amusement, and since often as not he was the butt of his own jokes, and the fact that it became a useful tool to disarm his critics or to put people at ease was a bonus. And I think that was more often than not entirely unpremeditated. But I think, like all humor, it suffers in the retelling, so perhaps we should go to these tapes which have been compiled. The first one is we start with my grandmother, because she, of course, started it all.
This is an honor and a pleasure that I've never had before. To introduce my son on a platform. I can tell you, of course, a great deal about him. I used to spank him with the ruler. He just keeps at a job and wants to finish it and wants to do it well. And I think that's what we need here in New York, somebody that works persistently and perseveringly and believes in these things. And so it gives me great pleasure to introduce my seventh child, Robert Francis Kennedy.
I want to thank my mother for the kind introduction. That's what we've gotten down to this campaign after some of these polls came out that we were not doing too well. We took Mother.
I had a lot of experience since I did it 72 years ago.
Yeah, I know. I'm going to tell them you did. Well, why don't you give your own speech? See, that's it. We don't. My brother and I never. The reason she's never introduced any of us before is because we never go on the same platform with her. I mean, we couldn't possibly compete with that. Major struggle between my younger brother and me during this campaign was where she was going to spend her time, whether she's going to be here or in that other state to the north, which I haven't dared say for 8 weeks.
The second selection is a sample of my father addressing a variety of groups. The first one is in Paris, to a National Democratic Party fundraiser, then to a university in Connecticut, and finally to a testimonial dinner for his good friend, Senator George Smathers, who was elected to the House in 1946 and was an usher at my father's wedding in 1953.
Minister, Mr. Secretary of State, Ambassador Alphonse, Ambassador Gavin, Ambassador Bonet, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I do not think it altogether inappropriate to introduce myself to this audience. I am the man who accompanied Jacqueline Kennedy to Paris, and I've enjoyed it. I spoke a year ago today to take the inaugural, and I'd like to paraphrase a couple of statements I made that day by saying that we observe tonight not a celebration of freedom, but a victory of party. For we are sworn to pay off the same party debt our forebears ran up nearly a year and 3 months ago. Our deficit will not be paid off in the next 100 days. Nor will it be paid off in the first 1,000 days, nor in the life of this administration, nor perhaps even in our lifetime on this planet, but let us begin. Remembering that generosity is not a sign of weakness, and that ambassadors are always subject to Senate confirmation. For if the Democratic Party cannot be helped by the many who are poor, it cannot be saved by the few who are rich. So let us begin. It might be said now that I have the best of both worlds, a Harvard education and a Yale degree.
1962, when I was thinking about running for the United States Senate, I went to the then Senator Smathers and said, George, what do you think? He said, don't do it. Can't win. Bad year. In 1956, I was at the Democratic Convention, and I said I didn't know whether I'd run for vice president or not. So I said, George, what do you think? This is it. They need a young man. It's your chance. So I ran and lost. And in 1960, I was wondering whether I ought to run in the West Virginia primary. Don't do it. That state you can't possibly carry. And actually, the only time I really got nervous about the whole matter at Los Angeles was just before the balloting. George came up and said, I think it looks pretty good for you.
The third selection, my father started the first live television press conferences, and although these were about serious issues of the day, the viewing public soon learned to expect his wit to surface if it was given the right opportunity.
President, it's been a long time since a president and his family have been subjected to such a heavy barrage of teasing and fun-poking and satire. I mean, there have been books on backstairs at the White House, and cartoon books with clever sayings, and photo albums with balloons and the rest, and now a smash hit record. Can you tell us whether you read and listen to these things and whether they produce annoyment or enjoyment?
Annoyment. No, they produce, yes, I have read them and listened to them. Actually, I listened to Mr. Meader's record, but I thought it sounded more like Teddy than it did me, but... so he's annoyed. We understand the... Excuse me, Miss Montgomery.
Mr. President, your brother Ted recently on television said that after seeing the cares of office on you, that he wasn't sure he'd ever be interested in being the president. I wonder if you could tell us whether, if you had it to do over again, you would work for the presidency, and whether you can recommend the job to others.
Well, the answer is, the first is yes, and the second is no. I don't recommend it to others. At least for a while.
And Mr. President.
Mr. President, the Democratic platform in which you ran for election promises to work for equal rights for women, including equal pay, to wipe out job opportunity discriminations. Now, you have made efforts on behalf of others. What have you done for the women according to the promises of the platform?
Well, I'm sure we haven't done enough, and... I must say I am a strong believer in equal pay for equal work, and I think that we ought to do better than we're doing, and I'm glad that you reminded me of it, Mr. President.
Frequently reversed.
Mr. President, in the 1960 campaign, you used to say that it was time for America to get moving again. Do you think it is moving? And if so, how and where? The reason I ask you the question, Mr. President, is that the Republican National Committee recently adopted a resolution saying you were pretty much of a failure.
Well, I'm sure it was passed unanimously. I think that...
The last piece is of a visit to Ireland while my father was president. This trip was significant for, in many ways, it was a homecoming, for it was from Ireland that the Kennedys and Fitzgeralds came to America. A note, the Albatross Company, which is referred to in this piece, is a company which makes fertilizer.
In any case, we're delighted to be here. Coming in, I met four rather angry Fitzgeralds. And they said they're tired of hearing about the Kennedys and New Ross, and what about the Fitzgeralds? And I said that was because my grandfather who was mayor of Boston, John F. Fitzgerald, used to tell everybody he was from Limerick and Donegal and Galway or wherever it might have helped.
There is an impression in Washington that there are no Kennedys left in Ireland, that they're all in Washington. And so I wonder if there are any Kennedys in this audience. Could you hold up your hand so I can see? Well, I'm glad to see a few cousins who didn't catch the boat. We're glad to...
I'm glad to be here. It took 115 years to make this trip. And 6,000 miles. And 3 generations. But I'm proud to be here, and I appreciate the warm welcome you've given to all of us. When my great-grandfather left here to become a cooper in East Boston, he carried nothing with him except 2 things: a strong religious faith and a strong desire for liberty. And I'm glad to say, that all of his great-grandchildren have valued that inheritance. If he hadn't left, I'd be working over at the Albatross Company. Or perhaps for John D. Kelly. In any case, we're happy to be back here. About 50 years ago, an Irishman from New Ross traveled down to Washington with his family, and in order to tell his neighbors how well he was doing, he had his picture taken in front of the White House and said, "This is our summer home. Come and see us." Well, it's our home also in the winter, and I hope you will come and see us. Thank you.
Is that it? Thank you. Thank you. As you've just seen, my father used his wit and humor to encourage cooperation, enhance his agenda, get us through difficult times, and to inspire people. And some of the people who were inspired by him and who worked with him are here today to tell us more about those times. Thank you.
Thank you, John, very much. Appreciate that. In Doris Kearns Goodwin's book about the family, she describes the young John Kennedy this way, quote, "Within the family, he became the warm and playful brother, the Pied Piper whose humor and vitality aroused an answering chord among his sisters and brothers and made him, at least for some of his family, the center of attention. From his first recorded encounter with the world beyond his family circle, as a small boy consigned to the hospital surroundings he would come to know well, we see signs of his recognition that personal charm, the capacity to warm and please others, could win the loving admiration which was not, as was his brother Joe's, his by right of birth." President Kennedy had a full quiver of personal charm few would deny. And few would deny that one of his sharpest arrows was his often self-deprecating humor. The most often quoted example being the time a little boy asked him how he had become such a great war hero. "It was absolutely involuntary," he responded. "They sank my boat." Our panel will, through personal recollection and their own political experience, examine President Kennedy's wit and humor not only as a component of his personal charm, but also as an essential tool of politics and governance. To lead off, Richard K. Donahue, Special Assistant to President Kennedy from 1960 to 1963, now President and Chief Operating Officer of Nike Incorporated. Mr. Donahue also serves as chair of the John F. Kennedy Profile and Courage Award. We're very fortunate to have joining our panel the second recipient of that annual award, Justice Charles Longstreet Weltner. Senator Kennedy has introduced him. Let me just say that we are very delighted to be able to be part of this exceptional awards celebration that we now do annually. Our final panelist is one who needs no introduction and consequently never gets one. John Kenneth Galbraith is probably the best-known Harvard professor. He served President Kennedy as ambassador to India and is known around here to have something of a corner on the wit and humor department himself. We'll start our panel with some comments, and then you're invited to join in. We'll start with Richard Donahue. Mr. Donahue.
Thank you very much. It's difficult to think of President Kennedy without thinking of his humor, because it was very much a part of the way he lived and the way he taught and the way he led. Unfortunately, when I prepared to come to Boston from Oregon this week, I prepared to come for the Profiles in Courage Award, and I received an invitation. They said there's going to be a humor panel over at the Kennedy School. Would you like to attend? And I said, gee, that'd be great. I'd love to hear it. And now I am hearing it because I have just been elected. And so I went to Dave Powers, and Dave is the historian. He knows all of the stories. Most of them he's made up, but the others, even those that are accurate, are great. And I said to him, well, tell me a story that really we can recount President Kennedy's humor. We thought of three, and we checked them out with Pat, and then two of them fell flat. There was one, however, that was pretty good. I think it was May Craig continually liked to bait him and ask him questions persistently. And she said to him, Mr. President, what is your favorite song? What is your favorite song? So he thought, and he said, well, you know, Hail to the Chief has a certain ring to it. I recall shortly after his election the question of how his government would be put together and how the people would be chosen was one of the jobs that I was involved with. And with the help of Sergeant Shriver and others, a lot of Harris Wofford, who was mentioned here earlier today, and Adam Yarmolinsky and others, a group of people were gathered together, and probably leading among them was then later Secretary McNamara. Now, Secretary McNamara was not known to President Kennedy. I mean, he was someone who almost came as a result of a lot of publicity he received as president of the Ford Motor Company in Time magazine. And he is, of course, a brilliant man and become a great friend, but was strange to President Kennedy at that time. And being the diligent student that he was, he went and he saw then Secretary of Defense Wilson. And he came to President Kennedy, and with all of the diligence and sobriety that was his, he said, Mr. President, he said, I've met with Secretary Wilson, and I want to tell you that I can do that job. And the President responded and said to him, Mr. Secretary, I want to tell you I've met with President Eisenhower, and I can do that job. It also was my fort during the course of that time to deal with him on certain appointments. He was in Palm Beach, and we were in Washington, and we were putting things together. After a lot of activity, he had chosen J. Edward Day of California to be Postmaster General of the United States, and I was working with him and others putting together the presidential appointees that under the Deputy Postmaster General, the Assistant Postmaster General, and all of that. And so from time to time, I would talk to the President in Palm Beach, and he was, of course, an acute, astute, knowledgeable politician. He would ask whether or not a candidate was suggested had the approbation of the Appropriations Committee chair and various committees and all of these types of things. One day I was talking to him about Assistant Postmaster General for Finance, and he said, well, who came up with him? And I said, well, the Postmaster General. He said, I thought he was happy with his job. These are my jobs. So also, as time developed and we moved into the White House, there were a series of things which are not quite as well known. as they might be. But one of them was a complaint that existed between Secretary of State Dean Rusk and others as to the fact that privileged communications or top-secret materials seem to be getting a lot of currency on the cocktail circuit. And he came to the president, and he accused many people in the White House of leaking top-secret information so that nothing that came would not be heard that night throughout Washington. And so he called Kenny O'Donnell, and one of the not necessarily favorite people of Secretary Rusk was Arthur Schlesinger. And among those who had been accused of this was Arthur Schlesinger. And so he told Kenny, he said, "Kenny, I think just to test it so that we can make the Secretary happy, we'll take Arthur off the top secret list." And then as Kenny went to leave the room, he said, "Oh, no, wait a minute. I better tell him myself. You're going to come out bad enough in his book."
Bad enough in his book.
It was that type of the use of humor and the direct way of both teaching and inflicting. You know, much truth is spoken in jest. It was that type of sharp edge, but also knowledgeable edge that led us all to think of him as I do today. I can't help thinking of him without smiling. Thanks.
Justice Weltner.
Thank you, Director Royer. If I may take a moment, my friends, to thank Senator Kennedy for his generous remarks, members of the Kennedy family for the unforgettable kindness that you have shown to me. It is a true honor to be associated with you, Senator Kennedy, members of the family, and I thank you. It's also an honor to be on this platform. John Kenneth Galbraith says everyone's ideal of what a scholar ought to be, and Richard Donahue is everybody's idea of what a lawyer ought to be. I'm right here. If we can get you back in office, Mayor Royer, we'll be in good shape. My favorite story attributed to President Kennedy is this. He said that Washington is a city of southern efficiency and northern charm. I think that's wonderful. I'm not sure y'all get that yet, but that's a wonderful statement. And having been exposed for a brief period in my youth to Washington, I must agree with that. I would like to address this topic as a person who sought public office during the tenure of President Kennedy, and what he as president made possible for those of us out on the hustings to do. I sought office in the world's greatest city, Atlanta, and we do not have the world's greatest record in Georgia for enlightened politics. As a matter of fact, you can make a pretty good case in a former era to the contrary. But the expectations of a candidate for public office were raised immeasurably by the presence in the White House of President Kennedy. We, as candidates, were expected to know something about the job we were seeking, and that was unusual. And I'll have to say in the rest of the country it's still a bit unusual. We were expected, because of the standards of President Kennedy, to speak with some degree of intelligence and to have some concept of what was going on in the world. And we were expected also to make a little fun of ourselves. That's a radical reversal. Georgia politics was a cult politics. Had no issues in it. It was all who was going to win, who would rule. And the idea of public policy as a part of politics was revolutionary indeed. That example in the White House raised, I think, the standards and the expectations of the people permanently, so that all of us began in some way to imitate President Kennedy, tried to find a suit that was cut like his. We couldn't find them down south. Belt Gallant Sears Roebuck didn't carry those suits. Tried to talk with just a tiny twinge of an accent from Harvard, but that's hard to do, too. Really hard. It was a wonderful thing to be a candidate for public office during those times, and I thank you for the opportunity to discuss that with you briefly today. Thank you.
If you noticed a little bit of Harvard accent in Justice Weltner just now, it's because I forgot to mention he was a fellow at the Institute of Politics back in 1971. So as you can tell, he picked up a little New England accent there while he was here. Professor Galbraith.
Well, I must add my pleasure at being here on this favoring afternoon with so many friends. And to say just a word, well, it'd be more than a word. I've been teaching at Harvard for just under 60 years, and it's impossible for me to get over any point in less than 55 minutes. But say just a word on what I came to understand as the humor of John F. Kennedy. It was something of itself. There were no wisecracks. I never really heard him make one. He wasn't a man to tell amusing stories. And he very much avoided scatology. I was brought up on a farm in southern Ontario and had a certain association with the barnyard humor of Lyndon Johnson. We both enjoyed the same departures from decency. And John F. Kennedy made it absolutely clear that he didn't share in our pleasure at all. What he had, the thing we remember, and I think the thing that's important, was his capacity for hard, succinct truth. The extraordinary thing is that the truth so presented and so unexpectedly presented gives you a certain joy, a certain inner response that is very much the nature of humor and perhaps is mistakenly on occasion so called. And my memory is of repeated occasions when this clarity of statement sent a thrill of approval and amusement through me. I mentioned just a few. One was at Hyannis a few days after the convention when we were talking about the campaign. And he said, well, I won't be troubled by the campaign so much because I can be myself. And then he said, and Nixon will be greatly troubled because he always has to wonder who he is. This was a truth that remained with me. I go back to an earlier occasion on the day that he announced in January the 1st, 1960. I had arranged that day with considerable effort to have a joint television program with Kennedy and Eleanor Roosevelt. It took a great deal of negotiation on each side, but finally, through friends at Brandeis, I got them together, and it went very well. And I listened to it with marked self-approval until the press conference immediately after, when the first question was, Now, Mrs. Roosevelt, does this mean that you're going to support John F. Kennedy for president? She said, well, it certainly does not. She eventually did, and with great affection, but not that day. That night, as we sometimes did, had dinner at Lockover's, and I had another fetching comment from Kennedy. He said, well, I had always assumed that it was possible that you might be the exception and learn something about politics. But I know that forever a Harvard professor will be a disaster. Carl Kazin, who was in the White House, and I once exchanged views on how we had encountered this candor and what we remembered. Carl was in charge of American imperialism, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, Guam, and Panama. And early in the days of the Kennedy administration, President Arias of Panama came up for a meeting. And Carl brought in all the papers, and the president talked with the president of Panama for an hour, and then he had to go for another meeting. Was meeting him again at noon and wanted some more papers. And Carl brought them in, and the president said, these discussions are not going very well, Carl. And Carl was annoyed, disturbed, and said, well, why not, Mr. President? Well, Kennedy said, we have been abusing them. That wasn't quite his word. There were certain overtones which are not fitting for a Kennedy audience. A Kennedy School audience here, where I always watch my language. He said, we have been abusing them all these years. And of course, I agree. That was the characterization of the candor of the president when it came to foreign relations, and an indication of how he felt the people of Panama should feel about the United States. I remember coming back just a few months after I went to India to talk with the president about some particularly, I think we can now talk freely about it, some particularly insane activities of the CIA. They were according support, flying over India to some exceptionally non-hygienic tribes on the northern Nepal frontier, and I was responsible for knowing about the overflights and keeping them from the Indian knowledge of the Indians, which was somewhat difficult. I went to the president about it, and he was resting his back in a bathtub. And I still remember his comment after I'd explained it. He said, well, Ken, he said, let me tell you something. There are no secrets in this administration except a few things I need to know. My own special pleasure was in my relation to President Kennedy on, of all things, agriculture. I do not, I must tell you, have a degree in economics, only in agricultural economics. And in 1956, I had urged him not to support a particular piece of legislation, flexible price supports, which he did support and which had a very damaging effect on his vice presidential aspiration, such as it was in 1956. He trusted me to be aligned with people knowledgeable on this subject like John Culver from then on. And one of the most agreeable comments I ever had from him was, I don't want to hear about farming from anybody but you, Ken. And I certainly don't want to hear about it from you either. My final observation, which I also still treasure, it occurred to me that Kennedy, having this view of the truth, would appreciate it in telegrams coming from Delhi. And so I tried for a long time to offer truth as distinct from bureaucratic truth in my telegrams. And I marked them top secret and not for circulation in order that they would have the widest possible distribution in the State Department. And on one occasion, Secretary Rusk, now I'm sure treated extremely well, I'm sure was treated extremely well in Schlesier's book, went to the president, or went to MacGeorge Bundy to ask if these telegrams couldn't be stopped. And Bundy sent me a telegram telling of this request and telling me that the president thought they were the truth and that they were among the only few telegrams that, since they reflected what he really liked to believe, they should continue. I think that, of my years with John F. Kennedy, was one of my proudest moments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Galbraith and members of our panel. We now are open for questions, comments, anything that does not resemble a departure from decency, as Professor Galbraith so eloquently put it. We are ready for your questions. Bruce, please identify yourselves. The microphones are down here. I'm afraid we don't have microphones up there because of the Massachusetts budget cuts, but we do have some down here.
Hi, my name is Bruce Goldberger. I'm a senior in the college, and I'll be graduating in about a week. But before I leave, I'm honored to have a chance to ask you a question. And what struck me when I was watching the videos, especially the press conferences, was the informality of them. And I'm wondering if you think that today presidential presentations are too overplanned, that there's no more opportunity for shooting from the hip.
You can do it right from your seat if you'd like.
Well, I had one observation, which I didn't, to save my 57 minutes or 55 minutes, didn't make. The first press conference briefing that I ever attended of President Kennedy's, there were a variety of grievous problems having to do with foreign policy. And the great foreign policy experts of the State Department had sent over a whole list of answers to the plausible, indeed the certain questions. And halfway through the reading of these answers, as we came by them, President Kennedy became angry for one of the very few times that I've seen him. And his comment was, I am getting extended lessons in evasion. And I must tell you, at press conferences, that's something I have already mastered.
There's no question that there's a lot, too much structure. I think Barbara Tuchman said that the worst invention that's happened in American political life is the teleprompter. That glass that sits up there that makes even the most humble seem articulate. And I mean, having sat behind President Reagan and deliver one of his speeches and watch him read every ad lib that was there and have the audience react to what a great natural orator and how well prepared he was, I recognize that that's what's gone into it. But it's the structuring of the delivery that now mandates exactly what's said. And the other thing is, President Kennedy looks forward to the press conferences. I mean, that was part of game, part skill, part putting it all together. But the final calls were his, and he got as much enthusiasm out of the completion of them as the participation in them. Frankly, he knew from the nature of the people who were out there, who just were regulars, where he could break the tension by a May Craig or somebody of that nature to call on. And he played it very, very skillfully. But he did it very effectively because they were short, sharp, He was the original soundbite master.
Okay, Bruce? Yes, sir.
Hello, my name is Evan Grayer. I'm a junior at the college. Foreign policy can be a touchy matter. I was wondering if there are any instances of President Kennedy using humor when dealing with foreign leaders, particularly Khrushchev.
Oh, the best story on the Khrushchev one was that as they met, and it was a very tense meeting, he asked him for the medals, and Khrushchev said, "That is the Lenin Peace Prize," and the president said, "Let's hope you keep it."
There was another one in the book, The Kennedy Wit, which in a discussion with Khrushchev, he expressed his hope for the outcome of the talks by saying that quoting the Chinese saying, "A journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step." And Khrushchev said, "Well, you certainly know the Chinese." And Kennedy said, "Well, I think soon we both will know the Chinese." Did you want to say something, Ken?
Well, I might add just one.
There's no budget here on time, so you're...
I might add one that is marginally related. I think we should always remind ourselves on occasions of this sort that when we speak of John F. Kennedy, we speak of a family, and we must also incorporate in that family the best senator that the state of Massachusetts ever had. I once told him years ago that I used to call up and try to persuade him on one point or another. Now I just wait to see what Edward Kennedy is going to do, and then I do it myself. Take that position. And President Kennedy once said that we had gone, that in our relations we had gone through 3 stages. First, when he was a congressman and called up to find out what to do about a piece of legislation. Second, when he called up to find out what the whole doctrine back of the legislation should be. And third, the joyous time that arrived when he didn't have to call Galbraith at all.
Christine.
My name is Christine Zaleskis, and I'm a senior at Harvard College. And my question for the panel is, to what extent do you or did President Kennedy attribute his humor and wit to his background, for example, that he was from a large family, that he was Irish American, that he was from Boston, or that he went here?
We're looking at you.
Oh, all right. I don't think there's any question that all of those attributes, I don't know about the Harvard part, but the rest of them had an enormous impact on them, and all you have to do is be in the Kennedy family and watch them back and forth. I mean, he was good, but I'm not sure he was the best in the family.
Yes, ma'am.
Hello, my name is Elizabeth Ortiz, and I'm with the JFK Library Corps. We do community service and Boston teenagers, and my question is, if John F. Kennedy was alive today, would the kids still think he was funny?
Well, maybe you ought to answer that.
I didn't understand it.
If President Kennedy were alive today, would the kids still think he was funny?
Yeah.
Well, did you think he was funny on those tapes you saw?
Yeah.
Good. Do you think Professor Galbraith is funny?
If President Kennedy were president today, we would be enchanted by his humor. And I think that enchantment would depend, as I said earlier, not on his being funny, but on his marvelously clear-headed statement of what we want to believe and didn't quite have the courage to believe before he said it.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, my name is Jim Higgins,
I'm a member of the class of 1938, Harvard College, and an IOP fellow in 1982, I think it was, Charlie. Some years ago, however, I was editor of a modest but sharpshooting newspaper in Pennsylvania, the Gazette and Daily of York, Pennsylvania. And at one period, President Kennedy had a policy of inviting the editors of papers from a particular state to come in and have lunch with him at the White House and discuss the problems of the particular state. We had a very interesting and lively discussion. Incidentally, one of the reasons for the paper which I represented having a certain notoriety was that we were the only paper in the country in 1948 to support Henry Wallace for president. That'll give you some idea of where we were at. Henry Wallace, not George, by the way. At any rate, at the luncheon, we had as I say, a lively and interesting discussion. And I made clear that my newspaper and myself personally had little regard for the policy the Kennedy administration was pursuing toward Cuba. So when the end of the meal came around and cigars were passed out, I said, do these come from Cuba by any chance, Mr. President? And he said, yes, Mr. Higgins, they do, and they're the last you're going to get for some time.
Our thanks to the Kennedy Library Corps for all you do and for being with us again this year. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we've had, I think, a good sampling of the wit and humor of President Kennedy, and I think maybe to close, we all just should hope that more of our politicians see the worth of that self-deprecating humor, and more of our citizens see the harm in the deprecating of our politicians that we seem to be doing with such fervor these days. A gentler and maybe classier time is one we've been discussing, and one in which lots of things got done. So, thank you for being with us on this birthday celebration at the Institute of Politics ARCO Forum, and to members of the Kennedy family, thank you very much for joining us and being with us again this year.